Chapter 1. The Night I Will Never Forget. I still remember that night as if it were carved into my very bones. The air was heavy, the kind that presses against your chest and makes each breath feel borrowed. The city was wrapped in silence, but not the silence of peace. It was the silence of anticipation, the kind that comes before the storm breaks. I had been through many nights before, some filled with laughter, some with fear. But this one was different. I didn't just live through it, I carried it with me, like a scar that refuses to fade. The first tremors reached us not as explosions, but as whispers. Rumors. A warning passed from mouth to mouth, from trembling lips to tired ears. They are coming. At first, I wanted to believe it was nothing more than fear playing its usual tricks. But soon the whispers grew into cries, and cries turned into the roar of approaching thunder. I stepped outside, and that's when I saw it. The horizon was glowing, not with the light of dawn, but with the cruel fire of destruction. The kind of fire that doesn't warm, it devours. My heart pounded in rhythm with distant blasts, and with each one, I knew the world I had known was crumbling into ash. People ran through the streets, some clutching bags, some carrying nothing at all, because in that moment, what could you possibly carry that mattered? Mothers dragged their children by the hand. Fathers shouted names into the dark, hoping for an answer that never came. The ground itself seemed to shake with the chaos of footsteps and fear. I wanted to run, too. But I couldn't. My legs felt rooted to the earth, my body frozen between terror and disbelief. I stood there, listening to the sky tear apart, and all I could think was, this is how history breaks. Not with warning, but with fire. When the first wave hit, it wasn't only the buildings that shattered, it was something inside us. The air filled with smoke so thick it clawed down your throat and burned your lungs. I could barely see, yet in that blindness, I saw more clearly than ever before. I saw humanity stripped bare. Neighbors who once argued over fences now clung to each other. Strangers became family in an instant, united by the desperate need to survive. I remember one old man, sitting on the curb with blood running down his forehead. He was silent, staring at the ground, clutching a photograph in his shaking hand. I never knew who was in that picture, but I could tell they were the only reason he hadn't let go. And I remember the children. Wide eyes staring up at the sky, too young to understand, yet old enough to feel the terror in the air. Some cried. Some didn't. Some were too stunned even for tears. That silence was worse than any scream. The night dragged on like an endless shadow. Hours felt like days, and the explosions stitched themselves into the rhythm of our hearts. There were moments when I thought it would stop, that maybe the darkness had had enough. But each time the fire paused, it only gathered strength for another strike. I lost track of time. Maybe it was 2 hours, maybe 10. All I know is that when the blasts finally faded, a different kind of silence fell. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of loss. The silence of a city holding its breath, realizing it would never be the same. When I finally looked around, the world I knew was gone. Buildings I had passed every day were now only skeletons of stone. Streets where children once played were covered in rubble. The air smelled of smoke, iron, and something else, the scent of grief itself. And yet, amidst the ruins, life still clung stubbornly. A candle flickered in a broken window. A woman sang softly to calm her baby, though her voice shook with tears. A young boy picked up a stray cat and tucked it under his jacket, as if saving that small life might balance the weight of all that had been lost. That was the night I understood what survival truly meant. Not just breathing, not just walking through the rubble, but holding on to the fragments of humanity even when everything around you is shattered. I tell you this not to scare you, but because stories like this must be remembered. If we forget, then the silence wins. And I cannot allow that. So I speak. I remember. I carry the fire of that night not as a curse, but as a promise, that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening to these words will understand. We are fragile, yes. But we are also unbreakable. I don't know how long I stood there that night, staring at the horizon burning like the edge of the world. Time didn't move the way it used to. Minutes stretched, hours twisted, and I felt as though the clock itself had been shattered along with the streets. At first, I thought I was alone. But the deeper I listened, the more I heard the city groaning, alive, wounded, breaking apart under the weight of fear. Somewhere close, glass shattered. Somewhere farther, a siren wailed, only to be silenced by another explosion. The sounds came in waves, rushing at me, retreating, and rushing back again, like a tide of violence. I began to walk. I don't even remember deciding to. My legs carried me forward, past the first collapsed building, past a car overturned on its side, its alarm shrieking into the night until the battery finally gave out. The smell of burning fuel clung to the air, mixed with the bitter tang of concrete dust. It got into my teeth, my hair, my skin. On the corner of an empty street, I saw a woman kneeling. She was rocking back and forth, whispering something I couldn't hear, clutching a bundle in her arms. At first, I thought it was a child. When I stepped closer, I realized it was only a blanket. Empty. Torn. She looked up at me with eyes that had already seen too much, and I had no words for her. What could I say? That everything would be all right? That the world wasn't ending? My mouth stayed shut, because lies are heavier than silence, and I couldn't carry any more weight. I walked on. The streets weren't streets anymore. They were rivers of shadows and debris. I passed people moving like ghosts, their faces pale, their movements frantic yet strangely quiet, as if sound itself had become a luxury we couldn't afford. Some dragged carts, some bicycles, some simply clung to each other like shipwreck survivors in a storm. A little boy stumbled out of an alley in front of me. His shirt was torn, his cheeks smudged with soot. He stared at me, frozen. I bent down, tried to speak gently. "Where is your family?" He didn't answer. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then, without warning, he turned and ran into the darkness. I wanted to follow to make sure he was safe, but in that chaos, in that endless night, choices were impossible. Every direction held someone in need. Every corner held another tragedy. That's when I realized something. Survival is cruel. It makes you choose between saving one life and ignoring 10. It teaches you the limits of your own hands, your own strength, and forces you to live with the weight of those you couldn't save. I kept moving. Somewhere near the market square, the blasts came closer again. I ducked under the crumbling frame of a shop and pressed myself against the wall as the ground shook beneath me. The sound was deafening, rolling through my bones, rattling the very air I breathed. For a moment, I thought the building above me would collapse. Dust rained down, coating my face, my clothes. I pressed my palms against my ears, but it didn't help. The thunder was inside me. When it stopped, I found myself sitting on the ground, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my body didn't know what else to do. The laughter turned into coughing, the coughing into tears. I wiped them away angrily. Tears felt like weakness, and weakness was dangerous. I wasn't alone under that shattered roof. In the corner of the shop, behind a broken counter, I noticed movement. A family, a mother, 2 children, and an elderly man, huddled together in the darkness. Their eyes shone in the faint light, wide and terrified. The mother raised a finger to her lips, begging me for silence. I nodded. We sat there together, strangers bound by the same storm, listening as the night tore itself apart outside. The little girl, no more than 7, clutched a ragged doll to her chest. She whispered to it as though it could answer her, as though the doll could explain why the world had become so cruel. I'll never forget her voice. It was soft, steady, braver than I felt. Children carry strength in ways we adults have long forgotten. After some time, minutes, hours, I don't know, I stood to leave. The mother grabbed my sleeve. Her eyes begged me not to go. "I have to," I whispered. "I need to keep moving." She didn't reply. She just let go, her hand falling back into the shadows. I stepped out into the night again, leaving behind one pocket of fragile hope, and entering another stretch of darkness. When I stepped back into the street, the night had grown colder. Or perhaps it was me. Perhaps fear had wrapped itself so tightly around my body that even fire could no longer warm me. My breath left small clouds in the air, pale ghosts drifting upward before vanishing into the smoke. The silence after each explosion was always the worst. For a few fragile seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. You almost believed it was over, that you had survived the last strike. But then, inevitably, the next blast came, louder, closer, crueler, and tore that fragile hope to pieces. I walked past the skeleton of what once had been a bakery. The sign was hanging by one chain, swinging back and forth like a pendulum marking the end of an era. The air still carried the faint, bittersweet scent of bread, mixed with the acrid sting of ash. It broke me in ways I cannot explain, that smell of something warm, human, every day, surviving amidst all the ruin. There were bodies in the street. I wish I could say otherwise, but truth demands honesty. Some were covered with sheets or coats, hastily laid down by survivors who had no time to mourn properly. Others lay bare, as though the night itself refused to let them go unnoticed. I forced myself not to look too long, but every glance carved a scar inside me. Each face became part of me, and I knew I would carry them forever. Near the old fountain, I heard voices. For a moment, my heart leapt. Voices meant life. I followed the sound and found a small group gathered around a fire built from broken furniture. They were sitting in a circle, their faces lit by the flickering glow, shadows dancing on their tired skin. One man was speaking, his voice steady though his hands shook. He was telling a story, not of war, not of death, but of summer. Of fishing trips by the river, of the way the sun melted into the horizon, of laughter echoing across the fields. The others listened, their eyes far away, clinging to that memory as if it were a lifeline. I stopped at the edge of the circle. They noticed me, but no one asked questions. In times like those, strangers were neither enemies nor friends, just fellow souls adrift in the same storm. I stayed for a while, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my frozen skin, letting the man's story remind me that beauty had once existed, and maybe would again. But I couldn't stay. Something inside me kept pushing me forward, deeper into the wounded city. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was hope. I only knew that stopping felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender yet. I moved north, toward the industrial district. The ground there was littered with twisted metal and shards of glass. The factories loomed like dark giants, their windows shattered, their walls torn open. Once, they had been places of labor, of sweat and creation. Now, they were carcasses, hollow and broken. In one of the ruined buildings, I heard coughing. I climbed over a heap of rubble and found a man pinned beneath a fallen beam. His face was pale, his breath shallow. He looked at me, eyes wide with both fear and hope. "Help me," he whispered. I tried. I swear I tried. I pushed against the beam with all the strength my body could muster. My muscles screamed, my hands bled, but the weight would not budge. He coughed again, blood staining his lips, and I felt the sting of helplessness pierce me deeper than any wound. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he was gone. But then he spoke again, softer this time. "Tell them. I tried." I didn't know who them was, his family, his friends, the world itself. But I nodded, tears burning my eyes. "I'll tell them," I promised. And then I left, because staying meant watching him die, and I wasn't strong enough for that. The night dragged on. My legs carried me without thought, weaving through streets I barely recognized. Landmarks that had once been familiar, the library, the tram stop, the cinema, were now mutilated, their shapes distorted by fire and ruin. It was like walking through a dream, one where everything you knew had been rewritten into a nightmare. At one point, I stumbled into a church. The doors had been blown open, the stained glass shattered, but the altar still stood, defiant in the smoke. Candles flickered weakly, their flames trembling yet unextinguished. A few people knelt in the pews, whispering prayers into the void. I sat in the back, not to pray. I didn't have words for God that night, but simply to rest, to breathe. The silence there was different. It wasn't peaceful, but it wasn't empty either. It was heavy, thick with unspoken grief, with desperate hope. I closed my eyes and listened to the whispers, to the creak of the old wooden beams, to the faint hum of life refusing to bow to destruction. After a while, I rose and left. The night outside greeted me with another explosion in the distance, reminding me that there was no sanctuary, not really. The streets grew emptier as dawn approached. Or perhaps people had simply gone deeper underground, hiding in basements, in cellars, in holes dug into the earth. The city above was left to the dead and the wandering. I was one of the wandering. The city at dawn was not the city I had known. The light came slowly, shyly, bleeding into the smoky sky in shades of gray and dull gold. But instead of revealing hope, the dawn exposed the scars of the night. Buildings that had been hidden in shadow now stood like broken teeth against the horizon. Streets were jagged wounds, filled with rubble, burned-out cars, and silence too heavy to bear. I walked through that silence, every step crunching over glass and debris. The air carried the sour stench of fire and something worse, that metallic, unmistakable scent of blood. It clung to me, even when I covered my mouth and nose with a scrap of cloth I'd found. In the first fragile light, I saw faces. Survivors emerging from basements and shelters, blinking like creatures pulled from caves. Their eyes were hollow, their movements slow, but they were alive. Mothers carrying children who no longer cried. Old men with canes, their hands trembling as they tried to steady themselves on the ruined pavement. Teenagers clutching bags filled with whatever they had managed to grab in those desperate minutes before the bombardment. Some of them looked at me. Most didn't. We had all seen too much in the span of a single night. Eye contact felt dangerous, as though it might pull us deeper into one another's pain, and none of us had the strength for that. On one corner, I found a group gathered around a man with a radio. The device crackled, its voice broken by static, but still, it was a voice. Information. Connection. He turned the dial carefully, as though coaxing secrets from the air, and we leaned closer, straining to catch every fractured word. Reports of continued shelling, casualties unknown. Stay sheltered if you can, humanitarian aid. The signal broke. The man hit the side of the radio, desperate to bring it back. For a few seconds, nothing. Then only static. The crowd sighed, the sound like wind rustling through dry leaves. Yet even those few words mattered. They were proof that we weren't entirely forgotten, that somewhere beyond the walls of our ruined city, someone knew, someone cared, or at least was listening. I moved on, my body aching from exhaustion, my mind a storm of half-formed thoughts. I hadn't eaten since before the night began. My stomach clenched, but hunger felt small compared to everything else. Hunger could be ignored. Fear could not. Near the railway tracks, I came upon a scene that carved itself into me forever. A train stood motionless, its windows shattered, its sides scorched black. It had never left the station. People lay around it, not all of them alive. Those who still breathed were searching the wreckage for loved ones, for belongings, for anything that might help them survive another day. The air was thick with cries, not screams anymore, but softer, weaker sounds, like the fading echoes of grief. I couldn't stay. Some sights are too heavy, and if you let them, they'll crush you. So I walked, faster this time, as though distance alone could protect me from the weight of what I had seen. But there is no distance from memory. By midday, the sun broke through the smoke for the first time, casting light over the ruins. The brightness felt wrong, almost insulting, like laughter at a funeral. I found myself in the old park, where the trees still stood, though their branches were blackened, their leaves burned away. The swings creaked in the wind, empty. I remembered children once filling this place with laughter. Now the only sound was the low groan of the earth itself, as though even the ground mourned. I sat on a bench that somehow had survived, its paint peeling, its wood scorched but intact. For the first time since the night began, I let myself breathe deeply. The air was harsh, filled with dust, but still, it was air. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for a brief, fragile moment, I pretended. Pretended I was only resting, that the city was whole, that the laughter of children would return with the next breeze. But when I opened my eyes, reality came flooding back. An old man shuffled past, dragging a cart filled with bottles of water and pieces of bread. He looked at me, and without a word, placed one bottle on the bench beside me. I tried to thank him, but he just shook his head and kept walking. His silence said everything. Kindness doesn't always need words. I drank slowly, the water lukewarm but precious. Each sip was life. Later, I wandered toward the outskirts of the city, where fields once stretched green and endless. Now they were charred, littered with craters, as if giants had walked the earth and pressed their heels into the soil. A small farmhouse stood in the distance, its roof half collapsed, smoke rising lazily from what remained of the chimney. I approached cautiously. A dog barked, weak but determined. Its ribs showed through its fur, yet it stood guard, defiant. A boy appeared in the doorway, no more than 12. He held a stick like a weapon, eyes sharp with suspicion. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said, raising my hands. He didn't reply at first. His eyes flicked to the bottle in my hand, then back to my face. Finally, he lowered the stick. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Yes." He studied me a moment longer, then stepped aside. "You can come in." Inside, the house was dark but warmer than the streets. His mother sat near the hearth, her face pale, her arm bandaged roughly with cloth. She nodded at me, weary but kind. The boy handed me a crust of bread. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. I ate slowly, each bite dry but filling, and for the first time since the world had changed, I felt something close to comfort. We didn't speak much. Words were scarce, like food, like hope. But sitting there, sharing silence with strangers, I realized something. Even in ruins, humanity survives. In small gestures, in bread broken between trembling hands, in doors opened when it would be easier to close them. When I left, the boy gave me another piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "For later," he said. His voice was steady, too steady for a child. I thanked him, my throat tight, and stepped back into the daylight. The city was no longer just a place of ruin to me. It was a labyrinth of stories, each corner hiding a fragment of humanity. Some stories ended in grief. Others, in resilience. All of them were mine to witness. All of them would live inside me, carried forward because someone had to remember. I walked on, not knowing where the road would lead, only knowing I had to keep moving. Because to stop was to give in, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I remember the last night as clearly as the first. The city had quieted, though not in peace. The silence that spread across the streets was the silence of exhaustion, of walls too tired to crumble, of skies too tired to burn. It was the stillness after a scream, when the throat is raw and the echo hangs heavy in the air. I walked through those streets slowly, almost reverently. Every ruin I passed felt like a gravestone. The bakery, where the smell of bread once lingered even in smoke, now lay in complete darkness. The fountain was dry, its stone cracked, its once proud waters stolen by fire. The park, where children's laughter had once chased the birds, was nothing but ash and bent iron. And yet, life flickered still. I saw it in the candlelight behind shattered windows. In the quiet hum of voices underground. In a child's chalk drawing scratched onto a wall, defiantly bright against the gray. Humanity had been beaten, but not broken. I made my way to the hill at the edge of the city. From there, I could see it all, the skyline jagged and scarred, the smoke curling upward like black prayers. I stood there a long time, trying to carve the image into memory. Because I knew the city would never look the same again. And I knew someone had to remember how it once was. The faces came back to me, the man beneath the beam, whispering tell them I tried. The circle around the fire, holding on to stories of summers long gone. The boy with the stick who still found the strength to share his bread. Each one of them lived inside me now, stitched into my soul. I wanted to believe there would come a day when their names, their voices, their kindnesses would not be lost to rubble and silence. I wanted to believe the city itself would rise again, not as it was, but as something new, born from both pain and defiance. So I whispered to the empty air, "I will tell your stories. I will carry them, every one. Because you deserve to be remembered." The wind carried my words across the ruins, scattering them like seeds. And maybe, just maybe, one day they will grow. I turned from the city then, not because I wished to leave it behind, but because I had to keep moving. The road stretched on, uncertain, endless, but alive. My feet were tired, my heart heavier than stone, yet somewhere inside me a small flame refused to die. I was a witness. That was my burden. That was my gift. And as long as I walked, their voices walked with me.